On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, as China-U.S. trade talks start in Beijing, where is the Chinese economy headed? Our international panel weighs in. And Russia and the U.S. in a spy drama. What's behind the scenes for the former Cold War rivals? Hello and welcome to another World Insight edition. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. New year, new liquidity into the new Chinese market. Last Friday, China's central bank announced a cut in reserve requirement ratio of banks by 1%. This means banks will have more cash to give out as loans. The cut is expected to release around 1.5 trillion yuan into the economy, which is aimed at helping small and medium-sized companies as the Chinese economy gears up for a soft landing.
Chinese market watchers are no stranger to what they call the Triple R cut. Last Friday, China's central bank announced its latest round of reduction in the amount of cash that all banks have to hold as reserves. By lowering the reserve ratio by 1% in 2 stages throughout January, it's set to inject 1.5 trillion yuan or $219 billion into the lending market, which is expected to make banks more willing to give out loans to small and medium-sized businesses. Since last year, China's central bank has slashed the Triple R rate 5 times, and the market expects more cuts on the way. Last December, the Chinese government pledged to carry out a monetary policy in 2019 that is neither too tight nor too loose, and this Triple R cut is seen as part of that effort. In a statement at the 2018 Annual Central Economic Work Conference, China's top officials say while achievements are plenty, the country's economy faces downward pressure. To turn pressure into fuel, policymakers outlined a series of priorities to upgrade its economic structure. They include stabilizing the financial market, lessen the burden for taxpayers, raise special-purpose local government bonds, cut down low-efficiency zombie state companies, strengthen high-quality manufacturing, speed up the growth of the service industry, improve living standards in the countryside, and stick to opening up. Last December, the government decided to open up new sectors to foreign direct investments nationwide. The new negative list for market access, much shorter than before, makes it a norm for foreign funds to invest directly in the Chinese market instead of an exception. Amid slowing growth, 2019 is a key year for the country to achieve its goal of becoming a moderately prosperous society by 2020. As Beijing and Washington buckle down to trade talks to ease external pressures, the Chinese government also lost no time fixing domestic concerns.
For more on China's plan to boost the economy in the United States, we have Professor Kris Versace, who is the Chief Investment Officer at Thematica Research, in fact, and also joining us in New York, Max Wolf, Professor at the New School University in Beijing Studio, Jay Huang, the founding partner of J-Stone Capital, who's also the former managing director of Intel China. I want to welcome the 3 of you, gentlemen. I want to start by asking you, Professor Wolf, if you look at the Chinese economy growth rate likely to come down this year, 2019, there is debate both inside the country and overseas about what to do with it. Some say China really needs to maintain certain growth rate. Others say structural reform is even more important. Professor Wolf, given the current circumstances, what would you say?
So great to join you, and Happy New Year to you and your audience.
Thank you, sir.
Look, I think that we understand that China has had one of the longest runs at one of the highest rates of growth we've ever seen, and we've actually had to remake our rules to make sense of the economic growth rate and the sustaining growth rate that China's experienced. So I think we have to keep in mind and be humble that we're in new territory here, and so it's with some trepidation, some humility that we should make the prognostication. That being said, the bigger job for China than 1 year or 1 quarter or 2 or 3 years growth is to transition into a mature, developed, high-income country from the most successful of the middle-income countries, which has been a long journey that's now well underway. That has a structural reform base in it and also an economic growth rate. Clearly, we're going to see some weakness in the total global growth rate. So Japan, China, even the U.S. likely to slow this year and to be below target. So China is very much within the global pack there. But there's going to be an extra weight, an extra pressure on this transition because of the sudden deceleration around trade and deglobalization. I think the bigger issue for China than the growth rate is the bigger issue for the whole world than their growth rate, which is we have now the former architects of globalization in the West, in some cases becoming advocates for deglobalization, and that's the bigger risk.
Well, that probably is about the ideas, but what about if you look at the economic figures? Mr. Huang, sitting here in Beijing, China has already started its ways of trying to boost the economy. This time, not the stimulus package, but rather bank ratio reserve lowering 100 point rather, and therefore unleash all these potential for companies, particularly small and medium-sized, to borrow. But the question is, how is this policy, together with others, likely to work on the really grassroots companies?
I think the intention is correct. As you correctly pointed out, and the banks have more money to lend, so the small and medium-sized enterprises can borrow more. But the precondition for the small and medium-sized enterprises to borrow money is to expand their business. So the precondition is their business has to make money so they can expand it. If their business is losing money, it makes no sense. They borrow the money to expand the money-losing business. So it's very important, for the small and medium-sized company, they can make money. So the government need to do more than just lower the bank reserve and the ratio, and also should considering other measures such as lower taxes.
Lower taxes to what extent? That's, of course, is another issue over there. Later, we're going to discuss that. Mr. Versace, what do you say?
Well, I think when we take a look at what has happened with the cutting of interest rates, this is very much in line with the playbook that we've seen both from the U.S.'s Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank trying to boost their economies as they slow. And when we look at the data last week from IHS Markit for the December PMIs, we saw that China's economy was, in contraction mode, both from the overall headline PMI figure as well as the new orders, which would suggest, a continued slowing, or at least another month of contraction in January. So it's not surprising that we would see China cut their interest rates. To me, it's the degree of the interest rates cut that we did see. That seems to signal almost as if the Federal Reserve were to cut not a quarter point or a half a point, but almost a full point, that China is extremely serious about jump-starting its economy, whether that's to small, medium-sized businesses, also reducing the cost of borrowing, not just for businesses, but for consumers as well. So I think it says very serious.
Right. Professor Wolf, of course, this time lowering the bank reserve ratio 100 points is only part of the policies that you have seen over the past 1 to 2 months. The Chinese government and also different departments of the Chinese government certainly have put out a number of policies. For example, in December, late December, the new negative list of investment has been put out there, suggesting what investment people can do. Earlier, there was debate about the list that was too vague, and now China certainly has put that out. I'm not sure whether the international press really have been studying that, and you see very little reporting of it. Meanwhile, you also see reform and opening up measures taking place, issued by different departments. For example, NDRC, Commerce Department, and some of the others. So, Professor Wolf, on the one hand, China is having a basket of policies putting out gradually over the past 2 months. On the other hand, do you think the world market has really received the message? That is probably another issue.
No, I think that the world market has been fixated on the 90-day extension and the idea of a potentially escalating series of trade disputes between the United States and China, and that between that and the sort of occasional rapid shift in policy from the American administration here that has taken up most of the bandwidth of a lot of the news organizations. I do think there's a general global consensus that the rate of economic growth in China has slowed, and then there's a huge debate as to whether that's part of this longer process of changing the structure of the economy, liberalizations, and also shifting toward a focus on the Chinese consumer from the global export market, or whether it's due to the tensions and the global disturbance created by new anti-free trade measures, particularly but not exclusively taken by the U.S. So I think there was a big distraction. I think we are also trying to sort of read the tea leaves of what the best positioned individuals inside the Chinese decision-making apparatus, what they think is coming for their economy, and the more aggressive their policy measures usually kicks off a debate about what that means about growth 1, 2, 3, 4 quarters out.
Mr. Huang, one of the key things that the Chinese are facing right now is about the debt issue, of course. The debt issue is not just the debt coming from the banks to the companies and the local government, but also the debt that the Chinese companies are borrowing in U.S. dollars overseas. So how do you see now? It seems that the latter is rather a newer phenomenon, particularly the piling up of that is a newer phenomenon. So, Mr. Huang, I know you've been trying to invest in different kinds of new technology projects all over China, going to different localities, talking to people. What's your sense of this combination? Because it's kind of new in a way.
Yes, you're right. In terms of all the government debts and also the enterprises debt, if we trust the statistics, the statistics says it's still controllable level, and we shouldn't be alarmed. However, and we don't know if we can fully trust the statistics. In terms of borrow the money in the U.S., I think that's a good thing. And if we can borrow the money in the international market, that also says, and then we have a pretty strong the credibility and the international markets and look at China's economy and with the confidence. That's why they would like to lend money to us. That's maybe another indicator. Our overall debt level is not too bad, as some people speculated.
Well, you're answering it in an indirect way, Mr. Huang, but to you, Professor Wolf, as an economic professor, how do you see that, the combination of both debt within the country and also borrowing in debt in U.S. dollars overseas? Because now, the dollar vis-a-vis the RMB is changing all the time, as we know.
Right, so dollar policy has become a little bit unhinged from its historical track, and if you borrow in dollars, you also have currency risk, right, FX or currency risk, because you'll have to repay those loans in dollars. So should you have an adverse move in the renminbi, in your local currency, then those loans become instantly more expensive. And also borrowing from international organizations give you a little bit more direct risk from them, and borrowing from domestic savers, which has historically been a source of abundant, inexpensive capital, largely inside China, also makes it a national story. So in an age of deglobalization, adding foreign and FX risk is not always a great idea. On the other hand, companies, particularly facing a lower growth rate, need to find efficient sources of capital that are cost effective. And having borrowed outside the country often gives you access to global markets, whereas if you need to export the capital from the country, then you can get entangled in various export or capital flight controls at some points.
Mr. Versace, we've seen in the world there has been a lot of celebration of new technologies, of AI, of robots taking the place of the current laborers. But on the other hand, the economies worldwide have not necessarily seen the growth rate as well as the quality of growth necessarily linked this time to the development of the technologies, and many contribute that to the geopolitics and the trade wars going on, not just between China and the United States, but also U.S. and some of the other players it has in the world. So are we going to see a lack of growth on a global basis despite real jump or real leap in technologies? That would be one of the rare occasions if we compare to the past 20 years of development, Mr. Versace?
So it's actually a very interesting question. You know, what you're talking about with these different technologies, at the heart of it is productivity. Productivity is, of course, one of the key factors in driving GDP, whether it's in the U.S., China, or anywhere else around the globe. I think we have to think about a few things, given where we are with AI, robots, and the like, that, you know, despite the headlines, they're still relatively small percentages. They are growing, and I think they'll have a more disruptive impact over the next 2, 3, 4 years than they've had over the last 2 or 3 years, without a doubt. As far as the rate of growth that we're thinking about, remember here in the U.S. that, you know, 2018 was a little bit of an anomaly in the sense that we had the one-time benefit from tax reform that really cut interest rates, that cut tax rates, allowing companies to free up capital and to invest. We don't have that, you know, added bump going into this year. So from an earnings perspective for companies, there's not going to be as much of a dramatic impact. But I think that when we take a look at what's going on, you know, this week at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, we'll see a number of new products, a number of new technologies that will be hitting not only customer shelves but factory floors, not in 2019 but 2020, 21, and I think over time these disruptive technologies will indeed drive not only greater productivity but foster a new type of job demand for a skill set that is very different than what we've seen in the past.
Mr. Huang, of course there's always a benefit of new technologies, but this time we haven't seen that really nurturing the growth rate and the quality of growth yet.
Technology development definitely can boost the economy, but they come in within their own cycles.
Right.
Take mobile communication as example. People nowadays talk a lot about the 5th generation, 5G, but if you look back in history, every generation, the new generation will come in for about 10 years. So it's too early for us to see the 5G benefit and in the next year or two. But you know, they all have their own cycles, and they definitely in the right time will come to help boost the economy.
So here's the thing, Professor Wolf. I mean, you got the world economy not necessarily growing at an impressive rate, and people are concerned about certain things, geopolitics included. Secondly, you got some of the major economies apparently in a trade war. Thirdly, you also do not see technology right now is going to play the pivotal role in boosting the economy. The question will be, what can we rely on for growth worldwide? Of course, the U.S. is doing very well last year given a package of policies for stimulus. But what about this year? Even though the U.S. could grow, what about the rest of the world? And when it's not such a connected world when it comes to trade, what can we hold on to for growth?
So, I mean, one of the things I think we'll have growth from will hopefully be a resolution to some of the self-inflicted wounds that we have in the global economy here revolving around the trade disputes. Then the other thing is, if I would politely beg to slightly differ, I do think we have gotten the stimulus from the new technologies, the AI and the robotics. I think they just came into a depressed economy. And I think that the economy has come and will be for the next 5 years very dependent on the global political situation. So around the world, we've sort of seen a lot of buffeting around of the norms, shifting around populists being elected and general publics being unhappy. And I think the challenge of the next 5 years is to have a little more distributional equity in the economic growth that will help us to move away from the more disruptive and populist politics. I think that's the great challenge of the next 5 years. And I think if we can do that, get our distribution a little bit under control all over the world, and resolve some of the self-inflicted wounds of the trade dispute, I think that will be our sort of X-factor accelerant to economic growth. And I think also if we get that wrong, we'll see the situation markedly deteriorate from where we are now.
More equal distribution of wealth, but Professor Wolf, what way are you thinking about when you're saying this? Do you see politicians are coming together with other sectors of the society to be able to come up with some common consensus that we haven't seen yet?
We haven't seen yet, but we've seen the impetus toward it. So I think the chorus of voices from business as well as government and the academy saying that we need to shift the distributional balance. Actually, I think you see it in the policy package being pursued in China right now, and I think you will see it. I think in the initial sort of 2016 moment here in the United States, there was an effort in that direction. So we were going to solve our distributional problem in the United States by accusing foreigners of sapping the opportunity for the lower and middle income groups. When that doesn't work, which it always doesn't, then we'll have to ask more difficult questions. But I think around the world, and whether it's academy, business, or government, that question is becoming the question of the era.
Mr. Versace, your thoughts?
I mean, there are several points in there. I think the better question to get back to is the one you asked about growth going forward. And from our perspective at Tematica, we look at the world at the shifting landscapes of economics, demographics, psychographics. And one of the largest phenomena that we, both in the U.S., and you'll see this also around the world, and in China, is the shifting in demographics towards the aging of the population and the changes that they will foster on various services, goods even, that are needed and required. I think we'll see over the next, not 2 years, but the next 5 to 10 years, a pronounced shift in that as companies look to cater to those changing needs. That, I think, from a micro level, not necessarily a top-down macro level like we've been talking, will be a demonstrative area of growth, and one that your listeners and your viewers will want to pay attention to, and odds are they will see that impact their daily lives.
Right. Before we go, Mr. Huang, your final words too.
I think this unequally distributed wealth, and we have to admit it, there's some reality, which is, in my opinion, the technology development actually contribute to some of this unequal distribution of wealth. This is the reality. We can try to blame on this one to other things like immigration or other things like globalization, but the truth is, technology development does have a contribution. We have to realize that. Unfortunately, we don't think we have a solution for that yet.
Not yet. Jay Huang, Max Wolf, Kris Versace, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Russia and the U.S. in a spy drama. What's behind the scenes for the former Cold War rivals? We'll ask our panelists after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Russia and America wrap up a cloak and dagger tensions. On December 28th last year, Russia arrested the former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan on suspicion of spying in Moscow. The following day, the U.S. detained Russian citizen in the Pacific island of Saipan and moved to Florida on charges of transporting military equipment to Russia. The tit-for-tat arrests led experts to believe that Moscow could trade the villain for Russian nationals held by Washington. But Russian Deputy Foreign Minister saw no need for an exchange, saying Russia would instead go through all the necessary procedures. For his part, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Washington would demand Whelan's immediate return if it was determined his detention was inappropriate. The arrests were the tip of the iceberg in a decades-long rift between Russia and the U.S. Espionage activities of both sides have been going on since the end of Cold War. The recent exchange of accusations and arrests have only added fuel to the fire. So what lies beneath the friction between Russia and the United States? Let's turn to our panel. In our Beijing studio, we have Alexander Lukin, a professor and director of East Asian and SCO Studies at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Sir, welcome to the Beijing studio.
Thank you.
Good to see you here. And also in Beijing, Rick Dunham, the director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, a veteran political journalist coming from Washington, D.C. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I want to start by asking you, Mr. Lukin, how much does it matter, the current debate about the spies from both sides, U.S. and Russia?
We don't even know if there are real spies or not, but even if they are spies, there is there's nothing so special about it. We are not allies with the United States.
The casualties, the front-line casualties, usually two sides picking on each other's spies when they try to pick pains of one another. That's always a practice during the Cold War. But Professor, do you think that's likely to continue this time? Is it a sign of anything much further and deeper than this?
It's too early to say that this is a spy tit for tat. I mean, it may just be collecting chits for political exchanges as opposed to the old Cold War style, we release one of your spies, you release one of ours. I mean, right now it's just such a deep political divide between establishment Washington and the Russian government. Not necessarily the Trump White House, but the bigger government and American establishment.
What about that divide, according to you, Professor Lukin?
Well, there is a divide, of course. We look at the world very differently. Not even only the Russian government, but also the majority of the Russian elite. The United States want to dominate the world, but they cannot do it, and they're very unhappy about it. And the United States doesn't have a concept of equal relationship. Well, Russia wanted an equal relationship for a long time, but in 2014 we understood that it's completely impossible. So that's the situation.
You know, Professor Lukin, there's a reality that we really need to take a look at. The things are coming in so many different layers. I mean, on the one hand, U.S. and former USSR were in Cold War, and now Russia and the United States are not anymore in Cold War, and yet not necessarily on good terms either. Secondly, you got the Trump White House, with the president seems to be, at the very beginning of his presidency, want to get closer to Moscow, and with the latter rather agreeing on that possibility, but it was establishment Washington that do not necessarily interested in it. And then you got also within the United States itself, they do not agree with one another as to how to deal with Russia and what to do with Russia in the future. So Professor Lukin, when you look at these divides, how do you think the current issue could lead us to, and where would it lead us to?
Spy issue is not important. We have much more important issues, I think.
Exactly. It's not important, but it is something coming to the surface. The reason why it is coming to the surface does tell part of the story, or is the preface could be of some story.
The problem is the differences in the world views and in approaches to the world. Russia wants to be treated like an equal country, and the United States cannot do it. Everything else is like secondary. I mean, even during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was dealt with kind of respect, and that's why we could have come to some kind of agreements, including the spy issues. We had a lot of spies at that time. We exchanged them. But if you are treated like a secondary country, and then you cannot come to any kind of agreement. Yeah. And we don't have agreements, and actually Russia does not care too much about it, because we don't have a lot of trade with the United States. We don't have deep kind of relationship with. So we think if they don't want to deal with us with respect, we don't deal with you. If you want to talk to us, let's talk. If you don't want to, we're going to talk to someone else.
Well,
nobody cares too much.
Moscow, according to Professor Lukin, is quite clear in their attitude. Is it? Is that what you're reading?
I think, well, he's right. That's the attitude from Moscow. And, I mean, he reads Washington pretty well. I mean, there is not a lot of respect for Russia in official Washington. If you have, I mean, the economy has just been terrible over the past 20 years. It's about the GDP about the size of the state of New York. Now, it is a very important military power, and there is respect and fear for that. Russian arms are all over the world right now, from Africa to the Middle East. And so, yes, I mean, you have to deal with that. But China obviously is the second economic power in the world, and then you have, I mean, Japan, the European Union, and many others before you would think of Russia, and as the professor said, there's very little bilateral trade between the United States and Russia. So it's a military, I mean, it's military relationship.
Security.
And it's security antagonism, though. I mean, when he was talking about the time his father was the ambassador, I mean, that was a time of hope. You had Senators Lugar and Nunn, and you were talking about getting rid of weapons and cooperating in security issues. We're beyond that. Donald Trump is unilaterally canceling arms treaties right now, and so I think we're entering a tougher period than even the difficult last decade.
Some say winter has seen a Cold War heating up, a new Cold War. Whether that is true or not, take a look at some of the things happening over the past few months. On November the 29th, U.S. President Donald Trump abruptly canceled a planned meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit. On December the 4th, Mr. Trump threatened to leave the INF treaty if Russia allegedly continued to violate it, according to him, that is, of course. On December 28th, Russia detained a former U.S. Marine, and also the following day, the U.S. detained a Russian citizen. On January the 6th, a U.S. Navy landing ship arrived in the Black Sea. So one after another, it seems that the rhythm of the drum is getting ever more intense and faster. So Professor Luking, you're very good with a geopolitical analysis. Now, is it the period of time in which Moscow and Washington just gonna take one step back and say, whatever, we're not necessarily interested in one another. We have bigger priorities. Is that what Moscow has in mind?
Well, as I said, Moscow is not fighting with the United States. One of my colleagues called this a unilateral Cold War. They're fighting with us, but we don't fight with them.
But you think about the Middle East, for example, that whether Syria or not, the U.S. troops presence going to be there. If you think about some of the other hotspot issues inside Europe as well, certainly the U.S. and Moscow are not necessarily seeing eye to eye on many things, and they are tackling some of the very important, strategically important issues.
Well, we do have some cooperation on the ground in the Middle East, in Syria, for example. And if the United States government would like to somehow make it deeper, Russia would be happy to do it. But we don't understand the United States, what the United States wants to do there. The problem is that Washington doesn't understand it itself, I think, because sometimes they say they want to change regime. Sometimes they say they want to help the Kurds. Sometimes now they announce that they want to withdraw their troops.
What's Moscow's bottom line, though?
Well, Moscow is there on legal basis and helping the legitimate government to maintain order in the country. I think it's
what about Moscow's bottom line in terms of what the U.S. could do in the region?
The best thing is what Trump is doing, is just get out of there.
But you see, within the last 24 hours, Donald Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, contradicted him, said, we're not going to do what Donald Trump said to the Turkish president. We're going to stay there until Erdogan promises not to massacre the Kurds, and until ISIS is completely destroyed. So the problem is nobody knows what if Donald Trump said something, if it actually is going to happen. They don't know if he tweets something, if this is a policy, or if somebody's going to contradict it, and it's just inoperative.
That we know for about 2 to 3 years already so far since he came into the office, the unpredictability so-called. But what does that mean for Moscow? Does it mean more opportunities for Moscow? Many wonder.
Well, Russia doesn't have any goals in Syria except that it wants to maintain the political stability there. I'm quite happy that if the United States withdraws and if the situation is stable, the Russian troops will also withdraw from Syria. They may maintain this naval base, but not more.
I would disagree. I mean, the key is stability, to have Assad on the throne in Syria, but to have a naval base on the Mediterranean, and that's going to stay. I mean, and that's going to stay because Donald Trump has no objection to it either.
And what does that mean for the U.S. longer term? Is Russia trying to take advantage of the current situation from your perspective?
Well, I think the difference is that President Putin has a long-term vision. Donald Trump doesn't, and so I mean perhaps he's taking advantage of the instability and the chaos inside the U.S. government. But I think it's just following through. I think President Putin is just following through on his long-term vision for Russia's role in the world, and particularly that part of Europe, if you would start at Ukraine and end in the Mediterranean.
But Russia has always been a card that you see politicians in Washington play from time to time, particularly during the election season. Mr. Professor Lukin, what about that? I mean, from now until the next election cycle in the U.S., 2 years, and yet with the current political fights already quite heated up in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, will Russia be one of those things that politicians from both sides once again want to pick up on, particularly inside Washington? And what would Russia's strategy to deal with the negative impact of that?
Well, I don't think that Russia should...
Being the collateral damage of internal political struggle inside Washington.
I don't think that Russia should care too much about the internal political struggle. The current policy is shared, well, the main ideas of this policy or directions are shared by the entire political class. So it's not going to change after Trump goes. Trump may be kind of extravagant, has extravagant style, but the basis of this policy is, as I said, the attempts of other countries to become important in the world, which Washington doesn't want to tolerate. Mr. Obama said, a very liberal president, said that when he was arguing for TPP, he said that we, but not countries like China, should decide on international trade rules. So it did not start with Trump. Trump just has, as I said, his strange style, but so it's not going to finish with him. So we should not expect, neither in Russia or I would say in China, a significant change in policies. Maybe in style, just in style.
Just in style, in order to deal with the current Washington. Is that what you're saying?
So we don't have to care if Democrats or Republicans or anybody else are in power there. The main course will stay the same.
I agree over the long haul because both Democrats and Republicans rhetorically are strongly anti-Russia. In the short run, it's a little different because Democrats view it as a free shot now. I mean, Democrats used to be less critical of the Soviet Union than Republicans. Now Democrats feel free to just pile on, especially because of the scandal involving 2016 election. Republicans, while in terms of military issues criticize Russia, they're much more sensitive because of the potential political damage to Republicans of Donald Trump's campaign's relationship with Moscow in 2016.
And therefore, what does that mean for Moscow to develop other ties as well during this process? When you say that Russia does not want to be involved in this internal political fight inside Washington, but it is a matter of fact that you are involved, maybe passively, but certainly being one factor there. So what does that mean for Russia? How could you counter the negative impact once again?
We don't have to fight the negative factor because it does not depend on Russia. I mean,
you sound like the Chinese philosophical way of doing Wu Wei. Everything you said, we don't need to deal with it. We don't need to think about it. We don't need to care about it. It doesn't matter.
Look. In Washington, they want to create scapegoats. Russia is one of the scapegoats. China is another scapegoat. So what can we do about it? Should we come there and say, oh, look, we are not a scapegoat, we are very good people? I don't think we should do that. I think that, you know, maybe craziness will go away from Washington at some point, and they'll understand it themselves, that they cannot fight everybody at once, at least. That's what the realists say. For example, people like Kissinger. Even when they, for example, when Kissinger and people like him were close to power, they tried to use Russia against China and China against Russia. Even from American point of view, this was a wiser policy, I think. But now they're trying to fight everyone at once. You cannot afford such a policy for a long time. Well, the Soviet Union tried to do it, and it collapsed because it's overstretched its resources. So you cannot really fight everyone at once. So I think someone will sooner or later understands this in Washington.
Professor Dunham, before we go.
I mean, on the fight everyone at once, I agree. Trump can't fight the EU. I mean, he's picking enemies among traditional friends as well as traditional adversaries, and it won't work. But I mean, to have some sort of agreement, I don't think that just playing old adversarial relationships does very much.
Good to have both of you being here in Beijing. Alexander Looking, Rick Dunham. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.